Hello. In this video, I'm going to speak a bit about mindfulness of thought, but before getting into that subject, I wanted to take a moment to dispel a common misconception that people have about mindfulness practice and meditation. A lot of people think that when we meditate, we're sitting there with our eyes closed, being quiet on the outside and quiet on the inside, meaning having no thoughts at all, just a clear mind. So this is something that often discourages a lot of people when they begin meditative practices because they soon find out that they're distracted by a lot of thoughts. And I'm here to tell you that if you are a living, breathing human being, you too will have many, many thoughts. In fact, science is showing that the average person has something like 15 to 60,000 thoughts a day. So that's a lot of thinking going on. So mindfulness practice is not about trying to stop yourself from having thoughts or trying to control the thoughts that you're having. Instead, we're practicing trying to ground in the present tense experience and watching thoughts arise and pass. And through this process, we begin to notice patterns of thought, and we begin to notice our relationship to the thoughts that we're having. So this practice can be a little bit tricky because we're so used to getting lost in the thoughts that we have. And this is actually also confirmed with some recent science. A Harvard study showed that after following a group of people over a duration of time, that the average person is lost in thought about half of their waking lives. Now that's a lot of time to be lost in thought. And what they also showed was that people were much more happy when they were not lost in thought and were just being in the present moment of their lives at any given time. So this ability to think and the thoughts that we have that we often get lost in, these are not in and of themselves bad things. This is a part of our higher cognition. We both have an experiential side of what's happening and an evaluative side of what's happening. And this evaluative and narrative side allows for a lot of important things like creativity and analysis, our ability to think ahead and plan for the future, or to remember the past in order to learn from past events. These are all things that occur as a part of our thinking world. The problem is that we don't have as much control over these thinking processes as we often believe that we do. So, for example, if I were right now to tell you to not think about an elephant, my guess is that you thought about an elephant in some capacity. So, when we don't have control over the way our minds are thinking, we can often encounter ourselves getting lost into thoughts that perhaps we don't want to be thinking about. So mindfulness of thought is this practice of returning our attention again and again to ground in the present tense experience and allowing ourselves to witness thought as it's happening instead of being sucked in and taken away by the thoughts that we're having. So an analogy that I find useful in discussing mindfulness of thought is the analogy of sitting on the bank of a river. So our intention to stay in the present tense is that sitting by a river, and you can imagine that the river represents the flow of your mind. And within this flow of mind, you'll watch things come down this river. So thoughts occur, and you watch them like boats on this river, arising and passing away. Now, the natural inclination that we have often is, let's say one of the boats floating down this river is some problem that we're having at our job. So the inclination then is to jump onto this boat and leave the bank of the river and try to figure it out and try to make sense of the thoughts that are coming up in an effort to try to solve a problem. So this is a very habitual thing that we do. However, with mindfulness practice, we're not trying to engage with the thoughts that are coming up, but instead allowing them to arise and pass, allowing them to float down that river and to let them go, and to then watch the next boat that enters this river of thought and watch it come and watch it go. So again, this is tricky business because we're so used to paying very close attention to the narrative that's happening in our minds at any given time. So it can be useful to think about thoughts in a few different categories to have a better idea of how to relate to them when they come up in our practice. So one category of thought that you can consider is the category of mental chatter. These are thoughts that are sort of constantly at play, that are going through our minds at any given time, that don't have as much of a charge, and that are easier to sort of let float down that river of consciousness without getting sucked into jumping on that boat. And it can actually be interesting to notice when it is you were distracted by that thought, whether at the beginning, middle, or end of the thought, just as a way to frame the thought more as a object of awareness as opposed to getting lured by the content of the thought. Another category of thought that can come up while we practice are these thoughts that are much harder to let float by, that have an emotional charge to them or some kind of draw to them, that when they come up in our minds we find are much harder for us to stay in the present tense, in the witness mode, and instead often result in us getting lost in those thoughts. With these thoughts that kind of call our attention more than we're able to prevent from losing track of present tense experience, it can be helpful then to shift our awareness into an experiential mode, meaning paying attention to either the emotional realm or the physical realm of experience. This is activating a different part of our brains that allow us to drop out of the evaluative and narrative function of the brain and instead drop into experience. So we're still staying present with what is coming up, but changing our point of focus to attend to something that is a little easier to not get lost in. And the final category that I'd like to suggest to pay attention for is the thoughts that come up that are that reinforce our sense of self. Those statements that are kind of like I statements. When you're sitting in meditation and you hear yourself saying, I'm hungry, or I'm not very good at this meditation practice. We have a lot of these thoughts and we listen to them very closely when they have to do with us. So it's definitely good to approach them with a sense of kindness and compassion, because we usually have a lot of feelings when it comes to thought content about ourselves. It can also be helpful to change the language we use once we see that statement. Like instead of when I am hungry coming up, instead thinking, hunger is here. Or I'm not very good at this practice. Instead thinking, self-criticism is here. And in a way, it allows us again to shift our relationship to the thought content, to allow us a better ability to witness what's happening as opposed to getting lost into the thought itself. So you can try these at home and play around with the realm of mindfulness of thought, remembering that we're trying to not be the thought instead, but see the thought.